conversation with Mary Poppins, which was only about 15 years ago. She reminded me of her many travels through Southeast Asia and becoming aware of some of the cultural phenomena of Southeast Asia, one of which is never open your umbrella indoors. So, sadly, I will close my umbrella, but I will hang it right here. Okay, so. I'll ask you guys, I ask my students at the beginning of this lecture, which I do in my introduction to Southeast Asia, the purpose of it is to introduce high colonial concepts. That's what I do. So it's fun. And therefore I ask the students, how many of you have seen the 1964 movie, Mary Poppins? Very few hands go up, but then as I go to sections and meet students, I realize that they somehow know it. They know a lot about it. They've heard the songs, and they're not quite sure when it all comes together, but it's there. So, and then I force the issue. So in the final exam, I have a question. It starts with a very short answer question in every single final exam, and it says, what was I talking about when I mentioned Mary Poppins? And it was like, and they all go to the PowerPoint slide and they've got it all right. But then my favorite answer was from an international student from China. And this is their answer to the question. It was about a movie with singing and lots of information about what Americans eat and what things they make. Well, he got it, sort of. So it's like, so let me start a bunch of things before we get into the fun part. Be prepared for lots of tongue-in-cheek fantasy and frivolity, but Al put it better already in his introduction. Based on her numerous travels to Southeast Asia, I already mentioned that's why we have closed the umbrella. All right. So in an interview I conducted with Mary Poppins in the mid-1960s at her retirement home in Helsinki, Finland, she confessed that her greatest regret in life was having not met Ho Chi Minh. Realizing that she had been in Paris in the late 1910s when he was a minor member of the French Socialist Party. As such, I have chosen to wear a Ho Chi Minh t-shirt for this occasion. At the same time, in our interview in Helsinki, Mary was in her late 70s and admitted to me that she was beginning to grow weary of Soviet rhetoric and hoped that our interview that I was having with her would allow her to chat about her earlier days as an activist in London, working as a nanny for the Banks family. I assured her that this was indeed what I wanted to talk to her about. Do you buy this? You're all so gullible. You should be laughing. Okay. So in fact, this is where this lecture derives from. It derives from childcare, mainly watching videos and listening to cassettes in the mid-1990s with my son Liam. One day, as Mary Poppins was playing in the background, and I was amazed, I listened to it. And I said, wow, I was amazed by the lyrics of some of the songs. Not the popular ones, but the ones that kept the storyline going. And those were the ones that I could hear. Right? On several occasions, I thought, wow, that's great stuff. So then I said, can I use that in my lecture course? Yeah, you can, you're free. Right. So I have ever since then been incorporating this into my lecture on the introduction to high colonialism. Sadly, Liam did not share my enthusiasm, and occasionally he would just fall asleep, which was, after all, the objective. So, all right. Before I turn the narrative over to Mary Poppins in the classroom, I've already devoted time in the lecture on words of a very boring discussion of Spanish and Portuguese colonial empires, and of the origins of the East India Company and the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, as well as introducing the Industrial Revolution, Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, and Britain's conquest of the world's oceans. So they've done that already. I know. Woo! Norman loves that. All right. After all that dull stuff, I let Mary Poppins tell the rest of the story, with a few anecdotes that are related to narratives other and to other observers in the thing. And we'll come back to some of those now. So, the narrative. There are a few other things that I like to do before the narrative. I think for me it's like you're starting out in England and you have this ancient nursery rhyme. So the starting point for me with students is the ancient British nursery rhyme. Says the fox to the lion, "Nose, nose, jolly red nose. And what gave thee that jolly red nose?" The lion says back to the fox, "Nutmeg and ginger, cinnamon and cloves. That's what gave me this jolly red nose." Whoa, okay, when was that? When did that lion, who is not indigenous to England, when did that lion get a red nose? Well, we know it got it from nutmeg, cinnamon, and cloves. So we already know when that was. That was around the 17th century when colonial commodities created red noses on non-indigenous lions in Great Britain. So there it is. And then to celebrate all of this, we have bread pudding. Bread pudding, what's in it? It's old-fashioned bread pudding, and it makes a big deal out of being nutmeg, cinnamon, and lots of sugar. And the British don't eat as much sugar as we do, so it's a little less sugar than we usually have. So, and then just the other day, this was not a part of my original lecture, just the other day, the New York Times featured this. How many of you saw this? Veronica, you should definitely have seen this. So, okay, what it was, New York Times article on February 11, titled "Manhattan or Pulau Run" in the Banda Islands. In 1667, the title said, nutmeg made the choice a no-brainer. So the Dutch and the Great Britain swapped places. Right? The Dutch took New Amsterdam, and and the Dutch stayed with the little island in Banda, which was all about nutmeg. So it's kind of interesting because this went, so here's nutmeg, here's 1767, and here's a moment when presumably the British preferred New York City, to the small island out in the Banda Islands and in the Maluku. So and here it is today. This was taken right off the New York Times website. So someone from the New York Times went there and took this picture. But what's interesting to me, of course, that does not mean that England had to give up nutmeg. They just buy it from the Dutch. And that continued over and over again as we go forward. Another way so this is another little offshoot, but it kind of sets the colonial conquests message that is in Mary Poppins. And therefore, we want to look at this scene. These two guys show up periodically throughout the movie. And here they are. There's Admiral Boone and Mr. Binnacle. They are retired officers in the Royal Navy. They now live in London, where they set up a warship on the rooftop of their apartment. And they go up to the roof and they kill people with cannons across the London landscape. They find enemies to shoot at. So it's a phenomenal moment in the film because it actually brings us right straight to conquest. That's right there with these two kooky guys sitting up on the roof shooting. So if we're looking at this scene, Admiral Boone, and it says, they're searching the city for enemies of Great Britain. Suddenly, the Admiral shouts, "We're being attacked by Hottentots!" Cheeky devils. And he says, and then they fire. So they fire their imaginal cannon and they kill all these people dancing on another rooftop. They don't, because their cannon doesn't work, but it's the whole idea of making fun of it, and it's kind of interesting. So what is interesting, I became interested in whether or not it is appropriate to use the term Hottentot. Well, if you look up Hottentot now, it isn't appropriate. It's a word that has been eliminated from proper use if we're going to be correct. So, but Hottentot are basically a people who are actually known as the Khoikhoi, and they reside in various parts of South Africa and what is today Namibia. Right? And that they are well known, but they were people who in the context of colonial things would be the enemy as they move into South Africa. But what I found out was, of course, the movie, where this is the scene, was made in the 1960s. According to the online stuff, the word Hottentot became not so good to use anymore in the 80s. So, hey, they're safe. They were before it became politically correct to not use this term. So we want to be able to see that. Okay, now we're starting the real show. And there will be music if the tape recorder works. Yes, it's a tape recorder. It's a cassette player. But that's another thing I show the class. Have you ever seen one of these? Do you know what it is? Most of them know, I don't know. And then one brave person will say, is that a cassette player? Yeah, that's what it is. Thanks. All right. So let's take a unique look at late imperialism through the sharp eyes of Mary Poppins. On the one hand, she's the quintessential British nanny. On the other hand, from my point of view, because I know her, as I just explained, I've had numerous interviews with her, she is an early 20th century socialist, feminist, revolutionary. Yep, who'd have known it? So let's pursue that. There she is, her beady eyes are going to tell us a story. It's a story that really is about the banks and imperialism and a whole bunch of other things. So if you listen to it and you look at not the main songs, but some of the other songs that are wiggled in through this thing, you learn a lot. Mary Poppins focused her critique on the bank. The bank is everywhere. You get sick of the word in the thing. She was the nanny to the Banks family. And the bank was the central issue in her story. Mr. Banks, who she worked for, actually worked for the bank. So bank, 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 do you get it? It's like, okay. The bank, of course, was a significant high colonial institution, provided much of the capital that drove Euro-American imperialism. It was the source of investment capital that channeled into colonial economies. And in a sense, we could say that the bank bankrolled private companies and colonial enterprises, and of course the symbol of the East India Company, which was also in one time connected to the bank. Okay, so the bank, we get it. All right. So setting Mary's time zone, what was the time period and when did all of this take place? All right. What was the stage upon which this thing takes? The time. The time was the immediate post-Victorian age in the midst of high colonialism, the beginning of the first decade of the 20th century. The King of England was Edward VII, who ruled from 1901 to 1911. They sing about the king, King Edward. There he is, okay. He was titled, and we know this from many sources, he's the King of England. So his title is King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Sadly, that's why I have a green umbrella. It's an Irish umbrella, right? So I said, and he was also of Ireland and also on unclassified areas of places called the British Domains. But also my favorite of his titles was he was Emperor of India. Emperor of India. Cool. All right, as we know, of course, during this time, the sun never set on the British Empire. We say that over and over again. So the place where the story takes place is London, on top of the world and full of itself. But sadly, if you look at the film and you panorize through London the way the film is picking it up, it's a sad place. You run across this woman who's sitting in the park trying to survive by feeding the birds and collecting little tuppences, and she's not doing very well, so that there's a thing. From Mary Poppins' point of view, she's especially concerned, Mary is, about the laboring poor, because as a socialist communist, she is concerned about the plight of the proletariat, as we know. That was her thing, right? People are so dull. It's like, lighten up. All right, so then the situation then is the emergence of a populist feminist heroine. Also, as I'm suggesting, a Marxist feminist ideologue, Mary Poppins. She pops into our story. She is analyzed and critiqued. She's analyzing and critiquing what she would see as the life that she lives as an imperial England. Mr. Banks, the house that she works for the bank. All right. The enemies. The enemies in the stories are middle-class men. Mr. Banks and his employer and the bank. Those are the enemies of this happy children's story. Mr. Banks himself belittles his wife's political aspirations. What does she want to do? Vote. he isn't very interested in her voting, so he pays no attention to it at all. Right? He found fulfillment, Mr. Banks, only in his work in the bank. And this is where he goes. So Mary gets it. She gets the fact that this guy is obsessed with the bank. Her lessons. Here's where we want to flip this thing on. Yes. We're going to listen to some music, and he's going to make sure. So 2 lessons are offered by Mary Poppins that we want to explore here. Mary's first lesson is that banks promoted colonialism and conquest. And so we just have to listen to the song where the bank directors tell us what they do. What do you do? All right, so Mary Poppins says, to highlight the absurdity of the obsession of Mr. Banks with the bank, and to point out the contradictions inherent in advanced capitalist societies, which of course is one of her objectives, Mary Poppins brought the children, Jane and Michael Banks, to the bank. Right, to the bank, so that they could better understand what Papa's work is. What do you do, Dad? You know, what is it? What does a bank do? It comes, don't worry.
If you invest your tuppence wisely in the bank, safe and sound, soon that tuppence, safely invested in the bank, will come pound. And you'll achieve that sense of conquest as your affluence expands in the hands of the directors who invest as propriety
demands.
May I, sir? Carry on, Banks.
You see, Michael, you'll be part of railways through Africa,
Exactly.
dams across the Nile,
The ships, tell them about the ships.
fleets of ocean greyhounds,
More, tell them more.
majestic self-amortizing canals,
Oh, it fires their imagination.
plantations of ripening tea, all from
Tuppence, prudently, frugally invested in the, to be specific, in the laws, terms, mousely graphs,
Fidelity Fiduciary Bank.
We'll do that. What did we learn? Okay. The bank expresses enthusiasm for empire. Banking gives one a sense of conquest. Indeed, it does. So let's look at some of the more specific things. The message is that small investors give their tuppence to the bank, which makes it possible for England to conquer and dominate the global empire, one that they all had at this time. Which included, I love the things that it includes because these writers are so great, we'll come to the writers later, majestic self-amortizing canals, like the Suez, like the Panama Canal, being built during these times. Fleets of ocean greyhounds for commerce and travel. Railroads through Africa, they got it wrong. There aren't that many railroads that the British built in Africa, but they built a shitload of railroads in India. So we switch it to India, or to Siam, or to other places in Southeast Asia, the Philippines even. We see that there were railroads through everywhere built by the British. They also, the one is the plantations of ripening tea. Of course, India, Siam, wherever you want to go. All right, so big profits, especially for the bank and its owners and investors. Capital accumulation, part of which paid the salary of Mr. Banks, right, and part of which sponsored conquest and high colonial development and hegemony. The message is crystal clear. Thank you, Mary. She wrote it. Oh, look, let's look at some of the things that we can see here. So we have the components of the sense of conquest. Railroads through India, there's the railroad. The British just love railroads. British children play with railroads. They constantly play with railroads. Plantations of ripening tea, the Suez Canal, the Cunard lines, all of these things at this particular time can be found and explained, and they're very operational, and they fit perfectly into the song. Right? So, also, something that you have to watch very carefully when you watch the film about how this happens, but I've watched it many times and it does happen. Her second message as a part of this thing. The observation is that Jane, the daughter, remember it says Mary's going to take Jane and Michael to the bank so that they can know what Daddy does. But when they start to really explain what was done, as we've seen it, the pictures here, oh, look, there's only Michael. And the director of the bank and Mr. Banks is talking to his son. It's a little boy is the only one who matters. And it's kind of interesting the way that plays out. The exchange is between the father and the son. Banking was men's business and it wasn't for women. So what we see here and what Mary is trying to tell us is that business, banking, conquest, and colonialism, they were men's work. It's kind of interesting. Mary Poppins reminds us that colonialism emphasized conquest, social injustice, and gender inequality. Duh. The colony. This is high colonialism or imperialism's height from the 1850s to the 1940s, depending on what place and how you want to define it. But its colonial rule at its most transformative phase is what we're talking about, when it was essentially a world of white men in white. So when you look at, you basically have the Dutch officials and you have some British officers here hanging out. It's like, wow, okay, white people wearing white. It's like, it's kind of a symbol of colonialism. Right? Forget it, Mary wasn't really interested in that. But if we go then to Mary's second lesson, she has two major lessons in the thing. This is the importance of commodities in transforming the West, which is why my international student said that basically this whole talk was about what Americans grow and eat and make. So we want to see what's going on here. Mary's teachings also conveyed by Bert the chimney sweep, a very important character in the story because he voices Mary's thing. Toward the end of the story, Mr. Banks is starting to lose confidence in himself as a banker, and he's realizing that he hasn't actually been a very good husband. So he's kind of whimpering, and Bert the chimney sweep comes to him to revive him. And it's an exception. He's trying to revive a depressed Mr. Banks with a song. Here's the song.
It's that Poppins woman. She did
Mr.
it.
Banks.
I know the very person you mean.
Bert.
Mary Poppins. She's the one what sings.
A spoonful of sugar, that is all it takes. It changes bread and water into tea and cakes. That's exactly what I mean. Changing bread and water into tea and cakes, indeed. No wonder everything's higgledy-piggledy here.
And there's the theme. No wonder everything is higgledy-piggledy here. Whoops. We're moving into a Filipino folk song. It's just not relevant. All right. It's a good song, though. So what we see here then is a spoonful of sugar is all it takes. It changes bread and water into tea and cakes. And of course, Mary definitely wants this message to get across because she really wants us to get into this. And this is, as we get into this, we begin to move away from Mary, but she's the one who led us on the way. So, and the ultimate point here is that yes, with what Mr. Banks says, yes, this process of moving towards high colonialism, what comes after, consumerism and so on, is what makes everything higgledy-piggledy. We're still higgledy-piggledy, and we're moving into other realms of higgledy-piggledy at this point. And higgledy-piggledy was interesting to me because I never knew how to spell it. Yeah, it's in the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's real. It's a real expression that the British use all the time. I had only heard it here in this thing, but it's like It has a lot of meanings about disrupted, tossed up, all kinds of things like that, but that's kind of what it does. So I love the expression, but I didn't know it. And in fact, Chanat, who works upstairs with me, he's the one who said, oh yeah, we say it all, he's studied in England. He says we say it all the time. I never heard it said except here. So it's like, okay, so the essence and the fact of colonialism from our point of view is it changed everything. And here's, of course, a 1874 canister or tin of sugar, which was circulating in Europe from Java, the Philippines, Cuba, from many other places around the colonial globe. So now we move in a kind of another direction to look at what is actually being said here. So another look is a spoonful of sugar is all it takes. It changes bread and water into tea and cakes, okay? Let's actually look at that and see what that means, all right? So flour plus sugar equals the national cake of England. We could call it a crumpet, or we could call it a scone. That's kind of what it is. Its ultimate produce in mass quantity is a result of colonialism. You also then take water. Anybody can get water. You add tea, a little bit of sugar, if you're depending on what you want, a little bit of milk. You get England's national drink, a tea. So think about it. Tea and crumpets, the way the British have been conceptualized, and also the way we and they have conceptualized it themselves, is over tea and crumpets. There we have it. But let's go a little further. When did the British become tea drinkers? When did tons of sugar arrive to sponsor a market in sweets, crumpets, scones, jams, and jellies, and chocolates? When did that all happen? Or we could quote the song from Pink Floyd in 1982, long before this, and it said, if you don't eat your meat, you can't have your pudding. So the pudding is kind of interesting here because it's the end of your meal. It's the thing you're waiting for. You don't get it if you don't eat your meat. Henry VIII and Shakespeare, they didn't really drink much tea. Henry probably had none, right? Shakespeare, of course, if you see the movie Shakespeare in Love, which is a great film, one of the things you find all the guys doing is drinking grog. So they drank beer and grog and other kinds of alcohols, but they didn't sit around sipping tea. So tea and sugar were colonial commodities. Water and flour did not become tea and cakes until colonialism. Did become mastered until high colonialism. When was that? So we're dating it somewhere around the 1750s and 1800s, but anyone who knows a little bit about the history can nuance those dates as much as they want. Here she is, may she rest in peace, the Queen, having a spot of tea. There's a historian who wrote about tea in England, so I'm going to quote her, if you'll bear with me. She says, this is Frommer, Julia Frommer, who wrote an article on the typical English brew. Tea is generally regarded as England's national beverage, a title granted to the drink in the 18th century and maintained today. By the early 19th century, tea had become a necessary part of English daily life and was consumed by all classes of society. And English national identity had coalesced around the icon of tea, and the rhetoric of the tea industry paid considerable attention to England's relationships with the suppliers of this commodity. Tea was above all a product of the British Empire. I don't think that's pretty clear. We don't need to even argue that. My favorite tea moment, and if you're a loyal American, this should be your tea moment also, is the Boston Tea Party. All right, so if we look at some statistics on tea moving across the world over a time frame here, we look at it and it just keeps getting more and more and more and more coming from different places, from China, from India. The tea is just booming through the world, coming from British traders mostly. And then in 1773, 600,000 tons of tea were shipped to the English colonies of America, resulting ultimately in one group of these things becoming the Boston Tea Party, with 340, I didn't know this until I looked this up, 340 chests of tea were thrown overboard in 3 hours, followed by, we know this, Revolution, Independence, and the American Constitution. T. So Mary Poppins anticipated, so here we want to see how come Mary is letting us do all this stuff and what's her agenda? So my argument with Mary is that her agenda is actually, her agenda is that she's a Leninist. And therefore, let's look at what she's saying. Mary Poppins anticipated Lenin's famous pamphlet, right, on the colonial and national questions. Becoming an early 20th century communist feminist, right? You agree with me, I'm sure. Her teachings were, among other things, and here's some of her teachings: capitalism's natural outgrowth was imperialism and colonialism. Banks and business made high colonialism possible, sponsoring a high colonialism across the globe. And colonialism fostered consumerism. This is the other part of her story, that colonial commodities transformed capitalist societies. Consumer dependence resulted in even more exploitative colonialism in the early 1900s. She also was a student of gender and discrimination, and in addition, she then notes that capitalism and colonialism perpetuated a male-dominated world order. Right. If we look at Lenin, Lenin, I hope you know which one is Lenin. The other guy is Marx. is it Marx? I mean, if we can say a lot about Lenin, and I do say more in class, that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. So Mary's right in sync with that. She sees that very clearly. So Euro-American capital penetrated each colonial society for the purpose of extracting agricultural and mineral resources. Even in Siam's crypto-colonialism, we see this happening very clearly. Commodities of extreme importance to Europeans and Americans. They brought immense profits to capitalist enterprises. The consumption of these commodities changed the way people are and the way they lived, and they still do, right up to the present. All right. So to extract them, colonial regimes transformed Southeast Asian economies and societies, making everything, as Mr. Banks put it, making everything higgledy-piggledy. Now we're going to see a whole bunch of things that move forward in time. Some of the major commodities of colonialism, particularly in Southeast Asia, but not exclusively in Southeast Asia, would be spices: nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves, black pepper, coriander, etc., which we talked about earlier. Many stimulants: tea, coffee, tobacco, and least we forget, opium becomes a major commodity of colonialism. Sweeteners: sugarcane plus tobacco, or plus cacao brings us chocolate. Plus cinnamon brings us all kinds of wonderful things that I'll talk about in a minute. Abaca, hemp, manila hemp, a variety of hemp that existed in that point only in the Philippines. It was cordage, that you couldn't have a ship in this part of the time without it. So rubber, tires, surgical gloves, etc. Coconuts, copra, coconut oil and soap, and tin, copper, and other ores and minerals, oil and natural gas. All of these things came. Therefore, I'm introducing people to it. So if we look at these, some of these have really interesting examples if you go forward, so I'm presenting some of them before we come to the end. Abaca. So, Port of Cebu, where, as Al mentioned, I spent a bit of time. I wasn't actually there in the 20s when this picture was taken, but I came shortly thereafter. This is a picture of hemp on the Port of Cebu and all what hemp looks like and how it comes in. It's important for cordage and any other things, and so on. But here's my favorite one. How many saw Master and Commander?
Oh, yeah.
A great series, first of all, a great series of books, then a great movie starring Russell Crowe. On the Far Side of the World came out in 2003. So ships. So what is really noticeable about that ship and Russell fighting off the bad guys is rope. This ship wouldn't function, its sails wouldn't work without Abaca, and the world's leading authority on Abaca is sitting right there. So it's like, and he's going to contradict me at some point. Russell Crowe is not standing, that's not Abaca. I don't know, is it? Yeah, let's see. But Russell Crowe then is there, he would be nothing without his rigging on the ship. So. Cacao. Cacao, of course, was a New World crop that moved first by the Spanish, even the Portuguese, to the Old World, into Asia and so on. But it became instrumental. A lot of the cacao didn't always come from Southeast Asia, but it came from colonial situations for a very long period of time. Right? And what I like about this is that when I think of really great chocolate, maybe it's because I've spent time in Switzerland with Mogi, is that I think, wow, okay, chocolate, Lindt. Wow, Lindt, that's the top of the thing. Wow, Lindt was founded in 1845. That's pretty late. So what did the Swiss eat in the 15th century? Did they have cacao? Did they have? No. It's 1845 when this little girl emerges to carry out her Lindt plate and so on. So it's very interesting. This was really all about colonialism. Sugar culture from cane. Here's where I will pause and read something to you. Here's my favorite of all things. Walking through downtown Madrid quite a while ago, and a little stall on the corner was selling Filipinos. First of all, I'm saying they're selling Filipinos on a corner in Madrid. What the hell is this all about? So I bought several. I still have this one. I would not eat it at this point because it must be rotten. But it has here. But let's dig into it. So first of all, what makes it possible is sugar. Sugar cane is it. So here's what it says. First of all, it tells you that Filipinos are made out of auténtico chocolate blanco. Pure chocolate, white. Then it says this, Filipinos, this is an ad. You can go online and find the ad. It says, crafted with care and passion, these delectable cookies, everybody, these delectable cookies embody the rich culinary heritage of Spain, combining a crisp biscuit based with luxurious chocolate coating, indulge in a delightful blend of textures and flavors that will leave you craving for more. Embodied, first of all, it's called Filipinos, but it embodies the rich culinary heritage of Spain. Of course it does. For 333 years, Spain ruled the Philippines and brought out lots of this stuff, and it still comes out. But I just think, so the Filipinos in the ad are invisible except for their name. The entire product is named after them. Then we have many other things about things that we can move forward on. These are just pictures so that the students can see things. Tons of sugar channeled or changed the world, and two major examples of this would be sugar plus cacao, the chocolate bar, sugar plus cinnamon, and this is for me, the Cinnabon is one of the best things that ever happened to airports across the world. The first thing I look at when I arrive anywhere in an airport in Southeast Asia is, do they have a Cinnabon? If so, I'm heading right there. And the most amazing thing that happened to me is on my most recent trip to Cambodia, landing at the Siem Reap airport, not Phnom Penh, that I walked in and I said, they have a Cinnabon! So I went straight for the Cinnabon, and there I was. So it was like, so the chocolate is, of course, in the world today gone a little nuts. And you can even mix it with nutmeg. You can get Nutella. So it's everywhere. Coffee, we know what coffee is doing, so we can go over this. Here's coffee as it was in the original thing. Coffee that can be combined. And I want to pause for a moment with this. I don't know how many of you ever got one of these, but I got one. I went into Starbucks to get a coffee, and they gave me a passport book. They gave me a passbook. They said, you can take this passbook and you keep coming back to Starbucks, and you can go through the entire colonial experience. You can go to that country was occupied by so-and-so, and you can get the coffee from there. Then you can go and get the coffee from there. And then you can get the coffee from there. And then you fill in your little passbook and you check, here, I did this, I got Sumatra, I got Java, I got Sulawesi. It's like so, but it's rather amazing because it's actually a booklet about colonial conquest. It's about all these places on earth that had been at one time or another under conflict. Then you go to the Union, our Union, right here. And your coffee is hot in your hands. Oh, it's hot. I need something to protect my hands. So you get a Java jacket. How many of you have ever gotten a Java jacket? Yeah. I mean, you've gotten these kinds of holders, but did you actually read to see that this jacket came all the way from Java? Just to protect your hands from hot coffee? You know, so colonialism is everywhere. Now, even with Java chip, which I, by the way, also crave. But if you look at all the countries, we can see lots of them all over. So rubber is another big commodity. We can see rubber pickers. We just spent a lot of time. It was interesting in my class today. It was interesting in the class because I was trying to figure out if they knew where rubber came from. And it was interesting because very few people in the class actually understood really that there's a thing called a rubber tree that is tapped by some laborer, and that he collects latex and takes it to a factory to turn it into rubber. It's like, oh, that's where rubber comes from. I thought you just pull it off a tree. No, it's quite a process, and we have lots of different things. Rubber. Tobacco. What could we do without the Marlboro Man? Right, and here's a whole bunch of things about tobacco. Right, and the other tobacco thing now is you can also make, that tobacco, of course, starts, we think of it as this, but this is the kretek industry in Indonesia, which is probably one of the largest places where different kinds of tobaccos are grown and disseminated through millions of people. It's still very prominent. Rubber. Coconuts. One of our students, Al's student, Philip Sarapat, wrote this seminal work on the coconut industry of the Philippines, which is where I got this great picture. I love this picture of this guy bringing his coconuts to the market. So coconuts are big, and we can see all the things that coconuts can do. Tin mining and processing in Malaysia, a very big deal. And lastly, but of course not least, opium. So opium became a global commodity during high colonialism and development. For over 200 years, it was globally marketed. It was not illegal. Then suddenly it became illegal as people began to declare that it was addictive, and they began to move against it. And then I remember from a lecture long ago when I first got here by Al, who actually thought that the war on drugs was kind of silly because this is a global commodity. You just don't say no to a global commodity. A global commodity continues moving even if you say no. So it hasn't stopped. The consumer obsession and additions began with colonialism. This is why it was a legal commodity through most of colonialism. And if we look at some of the pictures here, we can see that it's still a very big issue in the world today. Drug busts, school districts that weren't about it. We now legalize cannabis, so that's kind of cool. But we see, we even have to call in Captain America to help us solve the drug problem. So there's all sorts of things going on here. But I want to sort of end and then go back and do one other thing. So there's a lot going on in this musical that you can tease out and see. Then you wonder, what's it all doing there? How did it get there? Who were the writers of this stuff? Where did it come from? So as you look, it obviously was not Mary Poppins herself. Julie Andrews didn't think of this. She was just hired to sing the songs. Bert the Chimney Sweep didn't write these songs. He just danced and sang quite nicely. And Walt Disney didn't do it either, even though he was the producer of the whole thing. So who constructed the political commentary with this musical comedy? Who then was it? Who wrote that stuff? As Mary comes floating down out of the sky on her umbrella, we find the Sherman Brothers. How many of you have ever heard of the Sherman Brothers?
No.
Yes, Mary has. Yes, Norman has. These guys are brilliant. I wish I had known them. One of them has died already, Robert, and Richard is still around. But they won the Academy Award for writing the music and the lyrics for this whole thing. So what I would wanted to do is to meet them and say, dudes, what were you thinking when you said all of that stuff? Yeah, what did you have in mind? Are you guys commies? You know, it's like, no, they're Russian Jewish immigrants to the United States from their parents' side. They have a really interesting background. They did some early vaudeville with their dad, and then they moved into, they got hired by Disney. And as we learned from the movie Saving Mr. Banks, they did it all. I mean, so Pat Travers, who's the one who wrote the novel, we'll talk about this in a second, right? Disney had them write the music so that she would say yes. So if you've seen the movie you should see the movie Saving Mr. Banks, because it tells the story of how this all came about. Right? We'll look at it later, but these two guys, the Sherman brothers, they're unbelievable. Here's P.L. Travers on the left. This is the woman who wrote she's Australian, and she wrote the original text about Mary Poppins and the Chimney Sweep, and then it was taken by Disney and redone together with the Sherman brothers, who sat at their piano, and she would come in and look at what they're doing and listen to their songs, and sometimes she didn't like them, and sometimes she did, and then they would rewrite them until she liked them, and then it would play, and it would go forward. This is on the thing. So here she is with Walt Disney when they won the award. So in 2013, this is the movie Saving Mr. Banks. All right, so Mr. Banks, my lovable Mr. Banks, he's, of course, much more handsome than Colin Farrell, who plays him in Saving Mr. Banks, who plays the father of her. But then the movie could not have really been done. This movie, Saving Mr. Banks, in 2000 with Emma Thompson and Tom Hanks. Right, basically, the key people in this were the actors who played the Sherman brothers, because the whole movie is about going to the Sherman brothers to listen to this song. The Sherman brothers come up with a song. Hey, do you like this? I'm there to sing it. And they don't like it or they like it. Then it becomes the film. So these guys, these are the actors who played the Sherman brothers, not the real Sherman brothers. But the real Sherman brothers did it all. So if you look at this thing overall, and we'll kind of end here. I actually have one other thing I want to do. So 1964 was the first movie by Disney. There wasn't a second movie until Mary Poppins Returns in 2018 with Emily Blunt, which was I hate this movie. This movie is completely devoid of colonialism. Our two officers who sit on the roof killing Hottentots, they're gone. They don't exist at all anymore. It's a politically correct film. Colonialism is not mentioned. Colonial commodities. Some of the songs are the same, the popular songs that were big, but the in-between songs that set up the whole story, they are gone in this thing. This is a blank slate movie. You don't even need to watch it. But it was like, it's just about Miranda, dancing down the street. He's the chimney sweep. So basically, this is the Broadway play that went on too. But what I want to do here is just go, I just remembered there was one thing I want to do because it's kind of fun. Bear with me. There. Okay. Railroads to India. So this reminds me, we were in Delhi. This is a final story. We're in Delhi. We're sitting on I can't remember if it was a bus or some kind of public transportation with an old English couple. And it turns out that this was Indian Independence Day. It was Indian Independence Day. And we're sitting next to a British couple. And they're looking out the window, and the Indians are all happy and celebrating, and fireworks are going off, and they're celebrating their independence from England. And there's this British couple there. And I remember the guy, he leans forward, he says, "It wasn't all that bad." And then, that's what he says. And then he's going to follow up on it. He then says, "Yeah, look at all the railroads we left for them." So it was like, thank you very much for putting that up. I'm done. Thank you. If anyone wants to